Hi guys, this is me, Rusty78609, Central Texas, USA. It's Sunday at 3:12 p.m. and we're going to do the third installment of Texas Life from 1945 forward. We've got the first episode was 1945 to about 1949. The second one was in the 50s. So we'll start. Take up today. The third one will be about 1954 in that range, and then we'll move forward a few years and see where this goes. But anyway, in Kennedy, Texas, where I grew up, I was born in 1945, so I'm 72 years old, and I'm just reminiscing. This is just a little history of Texas life in the 50s now, 1950s. And of course, I grew up on a farm. We had the hogs and the cattle and the chickens in the garden and the whole thing, and a lot of privacy. We moved to a new place in the 1949. But anyway, yesterday I talked about, there was basically a shootout or a gunfight on Main Street in 1953, and a gentleman was killed named Duckett, shot by a gambler and also oil man, I found out. Named Dallas Husky, who was a pretty rough character apparently. But anyway, we didn't have many police in Kennedy at that time. We had a police chief, and that was the police department. And then we had a night watchman. As far as I know, there were no other policemen. In fact, I know there weren't. There was Ross Schuster. He was the chief of police and the night watchman. And if you got in trouble, if we were doing something that was wrong, then he would just say, "I'm going to tell your daddy if you guys don't cut it out." Well, tell my daddy. That was the sentence of death. So no, you didn't screw up. His name was Ross Schuster. Never forget him. Yeah, he cut us a mile of slack. My God, we did everything but burn down buildings. I mean, and it got worse as we got older, but we never did anything serious. We didn't rob anything, break windows out and all that crap. Well, mainly we drank beer and raced up and down Main Street and stuff like that. We'll get to that later. But anyway, we had a sheriff back then, and I've touched on his life, I guess, briefly in a few of the other videos, maybe a couple of them. This is the third one, by the way. Anyway, his name was Harper Morris. He was the sheriff out of Karnes City. That was the county seat. Kennedy was 5 miles away, and Kennedy was actually larger in population, I think, and maybe it still is. I don't know. They're about the same size. You could almost call them the twin cities, 5 miles apart. But it's total different atmosphere in both towns. I mean, talk about competition in football and sports. My God, it was war. But Harper Morris was a rugged old South Texas sheriff. And he wore, as I recall, he wore 2 pearl-handled pistols, 6-shooters, and he was only about 5'2" or 3". I know he was short. I'm not sure what his exact height was, but he was about 5'2", 5'4", in that range. And he drove a Ford Coupe, 2-door, and black, of course. And back then they only had one light, one red light. They didn't have that Christmas tree look that they have today. And he had a siren though. He did have that. But anyway, he used to come to Kennedy every now and then. He'd go into Sellers Drug Store and drink coffee and talk with all the guys. And then there was another place called Nona's Cafe he used to hang out when he was in town. He wasn't in Kennedy much. He mostly stayed over around the jailhouse in Karnes City. But nobody messed with Harper Morris. If Harper Morris told you to shut up, you shut up. Or if you didn't, your chances of living for the next few seconds were pretty damn slim. He did kill a few men. I mean, I never was a witness to any of it. I just heard stories about it. There was a dance hall across the tracks where people used to go and raise hell and get drunk. And I was told on Friday night or Saturday night there was a big dance. There was a fight inside. They called the police or called the sheriff. Anyway, he came in, went in the dance hall, and apparently somebody pulled a knife on him, and anyway, he shot some people. But anyway, he was rough, and I'm sure he buried a lot of characters. But anyway, at the jailhouse in Karnes City, his wife did the cooking. I remember that. I remember being told about it. I mean, I never got thrown in jail in Corn City, or Kennedy either, for that matter. But anyway, her cooking was so good that a lot of guys looked forward to going to jail. That's what I was told. But anyway, moving on to another topic now. Back then, in the 50s, I remember a man's word was his bond. And I can remember my dad, we had 2 combines, and when we got through with our crops, of course we got ours in first, because if it rained it would ruin a crop, and you never could predict the weather too far, because back then the weather, they didn't have near what they have today. They had nothing basically. And I remember there was a friend of ours that needed some help getting their flax in because their equipment, they'd had some equipment problems, they couldn't get it repaired, and their crop was just sitting in the field. And again, we had 2 combines, and we were pretty near finished, as I recall, because I was driving one combine, my brother was driving the other one, and we were, we only had a few hundred acres left to combine, and you can knock it out pretty quick but you can't start till later in the morning. You have to wait till the dew dries off, because the moisture content in the seeds can cause the price to decline. And so, we usually didn't start till, 9 o'clock in the morning, but then you'd go all the way till dark, or until if it started getting damp in the evening, you'd shut it down, because they were always checking the moisture content as the seed was being hauled to the gin, the co-op gin. My dad ran the co-op gin, but that was later on. But this individual wanted some help, and Dad said, well, we can send somebody, we'll send over 1 combine in a week or whatever it was. But anyway, I remember they just shook hands. Okay, and that's it. Well, whenever it was time, my brother drove the combine over to this guy's location, and combine started bringing in his crop, which worked out. He got it all in. But back then, if you shook a man's hand and agreed to something, that's it. You didn't need anything written at all. Period. And that's just the way it was done. Has that changed? Well, a little bit. And then we'll move right on to the next topic, which is, the schools. And this kind of goes along with the law enforcement. There were no drug dogs that came into our school. There was nobody that ever went out in the parking lot and searched your vehicle. That was unheard of. In fact, if you'd have done that back then, you'd have been shot by the parents immediately, all right, or hung. We had a principal, I won't mention his name, but he was a little funny. Well, anyway, some of the parents found out what he'd been doing. He and his family left town the next day. There were certain things you just didn't do back then, and that was one of them. But anyway, so things were a lot different. And then we get cars, of course, back then, cars, there was no automatic, in the early 50s, they started coming out with automatic transmissions, and we did get a Ford 1954 automatic, but I'll get to that in a second. But basically, cars were standard shift, 3-speed primarily, and no air conditioning, no power steering, no power brakes, no tilt cruise, none of that stuff, no power windows, none of that stuff. Some of the cars later on had power windows, but very, very few. And they came out with an air conditioner that was in the trunk of some of the cars, in the early 50s and so forth. We never had one, and until much later. But so the car, and they were also, you had to maintain them, back then. The tires didn't last near as long as they do today. They had points, plugs, and condensers, and you had to set the timing by hand and all that stuff. And the old belts and hoses just didn't last like they do now. And the tires actually had a tube inside. There weren't any tubeless tires till later on in the middle 50s. They started coming out with tubeless tires. I could be wrong on that, but anyway, cars were basically made out of iron, and if you hit something, you went right through the windshield. There was no crumple zone. None. It was amazing. They were built like tanks. But we also had an interesting little thing back then called service stations. And service stations were full service stations. When you pulled in to get gas, whether it was $1 worth, and that's another thing, gas was so cheap, I don't even remember ever thinking about the cost of gasoline, ever. So But when you pulled into a service station, somebody would come out and pump the gas for you. They'd check the air in the tires. They'd check the water in the radiator. They'd check belts and hoses. They did a pretty good little checkout just for coming in. They checked the oil and transmission fluid if you had it, or you had a stick to do it. But yeah, they checked a lot. And service stations were a hard thing for a lot of people to get away from. Even my mother, who died a few years ago, or several years ago actually now, she wouldn't go to a station later on that there wasn't somebody there to pump the gas. She didn't want to fiddle with those digital pumps. The hell with that. And that was a big adjustment. It's like people, not adjusting to the internet. But again, schools, no drug dogs, no nothing, no closed campus. It was a big race at noon all the way to the Dairy Queen or Creamy or wherever we were going to eat. And then in grade school, we would race to a little place called Leakey's or Leakey's Drugstore. But anyway, in 1954, Daddy must have had a pretty good crop because we bought a 1954 Ford, brand new. It had a dark green top, and it wasn't a Crown Victoria. It was a something else. Custom Ford, maybe it's something, but it was a nice car. It was 4 doors and it had a little chrome on the outside. It was nice, automatic. Boy, that was a big deal. Automatic, hello America, and but no air conditioning, of course, nothing, no power, nothing. It was a V8 though, that was new. But it was an overhead valve V8. Prior to that, they had the old flathead V8s, totally different concept. This was an overhead valve V8, one of the earlier versions of it. And you had to actually break a car in. In other words, you couldn't drive it over like 40 miles an hour. You didn't want it to heat up for the first 1,000 miles or so. And then, after it got several, like maybe 1,500, 2,000 miles in it, well, then you could drive it regularly, so to speak. But prior to that, there was a break-in period, and it took some time, all right? And, you had to change the oil after a certain, short period of time, get all the little shavings out and stuff. But anyway, cars were totally different back then. Totally. The kids today. We had an old '49 Dodge pickup. It was an old 6-cylinder, and but anyway, it was a 3-speed on the floor. All right, and it had a clutch, of course, and then the starter was right beside the gas pedal. And it was a little stem that stuck up, and you had to start the truck. You had to turn the key on. And of course put it in neutral, and then mash that starter thing all the way down and hold your foot on the gas pedal, and kind of get it going so that when it started it would run. Okay, but they didn't do like they do now. But anyway, that was a trick because I started driving when I was about 9 years old, and driving that pickup, believe it or not, I used to put 2 pillows in the seat because what Daddy would do, he'd be out in the field with my brother doing stuff, and since I was the youngest, and there were certain things that I couldn't do or wasn't big enough to do, I'd get to run the errands, like go into town, maybe get a part, or go into a feed store to get feed and stuff. And I thought that was a big deal, man. I was proud because Daddy showed me how to drive the pickup. We'd drive around the fields and stuff because we had roads around. We'd drive, and we drove on those dirt roads. He'd let me drive, and you always took pride in not grinding the gears. You know what I mean? And that was a big deal if you didn't grind, when you shifted or when you moved from like first to second, that you didn't grind the gears. That was a big deal to make it a smooth shift. And you had the clutch, but you could do this thing called double clutching, which just means you pump the clutch and that would stop the gears, and then you wouldn't grind it because there was no, I can't remember what the word for it now, but there's a thing in the gearbox that prevents that now for standard shift. But anyway, back then they didn't have that. So anyway, but as far as driving into town, I did. At 9 years old, I'd drive right into the feed store or drive to Motor Supply and get parts, and back out in the field I'd go. And there wasn't a place to stop and get Cokes and soda water and all that stuff. We had water, and that's about it. So you just went to town, did your thing, came back. That was a big honor. As far as getting a driver's license, back when I was growing up, you could get a driver's license without any. I don't think we had driver's ed, but I don't know that it was required. But you could get a driver's license at age 14, and I got mine at age 14. You didn't need it because no one ever stopped you for driving without a license anyway. We had highway patrolmen But you know, they never bothered anybody. You know, unless you were really doing something stupid, they didn't bother you at all. I mean, if you were really speeding, they'd pull you over. But back then, they didn't have the radar guns. Okay, they had to clock you. They called it clocking you. And what that meant was, they would get behind you, and once they determined they were at the same speed you were, that was the speed you were going. So in other words, if they got behind you, you were going 70 and a 50. When they got up to 70, and it was, you know, there was a way for them to determine that you weren't moving away from them or coming back, well, then they would just guesstimate that your speed was approximately 70 and give you a ticket. But they called it clocking you. But yeah, that was, you had to be careful with that. I mean, the older I got, and anyway, they used to clock me. I remember that. But 1954, we got a Ford, new Ford, as I mentioned, and we also took a vacation, the first one and the last one we ever went on. It was about 2 weeks, maybe more. It might have been longer. And we went into, you know, of course, New Mexico, Arizona, up into Utah. Went to, my mother was a big Mormon, so we went to Salt Lake City. And, you know, religion wasn't a big thing in our family. Mother was big into religion. You know, Daddy wasn't much into it at all. I mean, he at first he didn't go at all, and there was a little cat fight about that. And but he didn't go. What he would do, Mother would say something about church, and he said, "Well, I got to go check the crop." So you know, all the boys, you know, Daddy and my brother and I would hop in the truck, and we'd drive around the fields till Mother left to go to church. Mother and the girls went to church, and then whenever I guess Daddy knew they were gone to church, he'd head into town. We'd go to Nona's Cafe, and my brother and I'd play a pinball machine while they drank coffee and talked. But again, I don't know if my daddy drank coffee or not. But anyway, that's kind of the way it was from in the mid 50s for me. I got a motor scooter, like 1957. I got a Cushman Eagle, 8 horsepower, and the way I got that was I'm trying to see how much time maybe I can get this story in too. But anyway, this is. I really wanted a Cushman Eagle motor scooter. I really did. We'd go to Beeville, Texas, 30 miles away. They had a Cushman dealer there, and while Mother was shopping, I'd walk to that dealership and just sit there on that thing and dream about it. Anyway, Daddy said, "Okay, here's what we'll do. I got 10 acres. We had 10 acres up on the edge of a hill, an incline, and it hadn't been cleared totally. It still had stumps and rocks and stuff in it. He said, I tell you what, if you'll clear it, plant it, whatever you get out of that 10 acres, you can have to buy you a motor scooter." All right. Anyway, I never knew how much I got out of it, but anyway, so I did. Me and old Andres went down there. He took the stumps, used them for his fireplace, and then the rocks and stuff we just piled up at the end of the property line. And anyway, when it came time to harvest it in the summer, I had a pretty good crop. It looked all right to me. It looked damn good to me. It looked like gold. And so anyway, we harvested that deal, and I remember driving into town because I drove the truck in with that load of seed, and because my brother combined it, and there was an auger on the combine that pumps the seed, the flax seed, into the truck, and you know, you just pull up beside it. You know, now they keep driving while they're doing it, but back then the combine stopped, and they would pump the flax seed into the truck, and then every time Butch got a hopper full, is what they called it on the combine, then Butch was my brother, of course, and then he would empty it into this truck I was driving, and then once he'd combined that 10 acres, boy, I hauled it to the co-op to dump, and then Daddy, of course, got the ticket for whatever it was, the weight, and of course that's how you get paid. And of course I never even knew how much it was, but later on I did get a motor scooter. We drove to San Antonio, went to a Cushman dealer there. I don't know why we didn't go to the one in Beeville, we just didn't. And we got it in San Antonio, got 8 horsepower, it had dual exhaust, chrome. Anyway, it was just one pipe and then it split. And but anyway, it was a whole new world, boys. Did I have a license to drive it? No. Did I care? No. Did anyone care? No. I was 12. I was 12 years old. You know, you couldn't get a license of any kind. But back then, if you it was on a motor scooter, they said you didn't have to have a license, or at least that's what we concluded, or whatever. I don't. Nobody ever said anything about it. But anyway, but you had to break it in. It was an 8 horsepower Briggs and Stratton, 4-cycle engine. You had to change oil and all that stuff. Anyway, we had to drive real slow, like 20 miles an hour for all the way back from San Antonio, and I think you had to go 250 miles or 300 miles before you could go any faster. I mean, because you didn't want to overheat it. But same way with cars, are similar. Anyway, so we got back. And here's my way my daddy worked. You know, there was no, must have been some kind of owner's manual. I don't know. I never saw it. I just remember my daddy said, okay, now, because apparently he had talked to the people at the dealership and found out what needed to be done. You had to oil this little throw-out bearing on the clutch, and you know, the chain had to be adjusted periodically. You had to keep the chain greased and all that stuff. There were a few things you had to do to maintain it properly. Change the oil, of course. Of course, we had all that stuff out on the farm. No big deal. All the grease tools and everything. And I knew how to use them. So anyway, he showed me one time. One time. Oh, and it was also hard to start. It had a little lift-up pedal, and it would hold in position like this, and then you had to put your foot on it and press it down. And I wasn't heavy enough. I only weighed about 98, 95 pounds. But anyway, and it was in the middle. It was in an awkward position. But anyway, you had to lift it up and then press it down, and the engine would, it turned the engine over. And of course, you had a key you turned on. But anyway, what I would do is I'd just jump up in the air. I mean, I'd hold my foot up, and then I'd just jump up and put all my weight, all my force on it, and I could barely start it. But I got better and better and better. And of course, the engine got looser and looser and looser, and that worked out great. But boy, it was a new world. A new world. I was free. There was no helmet, no nothing. I didn't wear any gloves, leather, or nothing. Did I ever come off of it? Yeah, one time. And I hit a fire plug, but I won't get into that. I was looking at a girl. Never mind. That never happens to anybody, does it? But anyway, having said that, the motor scooter was a whole new world. I went everywhere. Of course, I didn't have to worry about gasoline because we had a big. I've told this story before. You know, we had a 550-gallon gasoline tank on the property, near our house. Not too near, but it was a couple of 100 yards. And that's how we filled the tanks on the gasoline equipment we had. And because we had one butane, the rest of them were gasoline. And so I would fill that thing up whenever I needed to, not a problem. And but anyway, we'll end that there with the Cushman Eagle story, and you know, kind of what cars and driving around was like. But you know, the police was never a problem. We never even thought about them at all. I mean, of course, they didn't harass you then at all. Nobody was on an ego trip. You know, they didn't pull you over just to say hi or, you know, jack with you. That never happened. If it did happen, they were out of town quick. You know, but a totally different era. I'm glad I lived through that period. Probably some of the best times in this country. Because it was, you know, shortly after World War II. This country was booming. I mean, you could find a job anywhere making good money and work there 30 or 40 years and retire, and that ain't happening now. And having said that, thumbs up was it. Yeah, we'll end it here. And then so this gets us through about 57, 58 in there, and then we'll move forward. You know, how many more videos this will be, I don't know. Again, this will be video number 3, and this is me, Rusty78609, saying thumbs up, carpe diem, adios, bye-bye. Buy USA made when you can. Drink plenty of water. 3 or 4 quarts a day will not hurt you. Will help you avoid gout, kidney stones, and if you're diabetic, it will help you balance your sugar levels in your blood. And also, if you are overweight and you want to lose weight, if you drink plenty of water, you'll feel full and you won't want to snack. That'll help you lose weight. Another thing you can do is take deep breaths in through your nose, out through your mouth several times a day. What does that do? That relieves stress and lowers your blood pressure. It does. It actually works. So those 2 things right there, you're totally in control of that, and that'll make you a healthier individual right there. Just those 2 simple things. Now, if you want to add some more ingredients, go to step 3. Eat less. That's it. Just eat less. Simply eat less. Okay? And eat healthy. That's all. Don't eat out too much. What else? Don't keep junk food in your house. And, you know, because that way if you want to snack, you'll have to eat something healthy. Like right now, I got the munchies because I'd like to have some candy or something, but I ain't got any, so I can't do it. So having said that, guys, from Central Texas, USA, the Texas Living from 1945, Volume 3, or Video 3, is completed. Adios, amigos. Bye-bye.